please explain why China and Russia were so important in the success of African liberation movements?
Sure. It was China, and at that time was still the Soviet Union, right? Until the collapse of the Berlin Wall in the 1990s. They came from a different history. China itself was a victim, as you know, of Western aggression, Western imperialism. The British launched, and the other Western countries, the Opium War against China, because they wanted to keep the Chinese addicted. And when the Chinese started rebelling, because they didn't want the opium anymore, they crushed them. How dare you reject, opium? So China was a playing field for the West, just like Africa has been historically, and to a large extent still is. So China could relate to that African experience. And then China had the Chinese Revolution, of course, when they kicked out the Western puppet, essentially. And he ended up running what is now Taiwan, after he was defeated by Chairman Mao and the Communist Party, General Chiang Kai-shek, who was supported by the West. So he went to Taiwan. So the history of China wanted friends, because obviously they wanted to try to snuff the Chinese Revolution from the very beginning. So China obviously wanted friends in particularly from countries that had experienced the history of imperialism, and Africa became a natural ally. And at that time, Africa was still colonized. African countries, beginning with Ghana, winning its independence in 1957, in March. In fact, we're celebrating it now, March 1957. Most African countries did not win until in the 1960s. And then some did not win till the 1970s. And in the 1980, in the case of what was Rhodesia, became Zimbabwe. And South Africa, as you know, not until 1994, when Mandela was elected the first African president of South Africa. And for the liberation armies that had to fight for Africa's independence, the weapons and the training came from China, the People's Republic of China, and from what was then the Soviet Union. So they would take Africans to their countries, train them in warfare, how to become officers, and they will also give them scholarships, and they will also give them weapons. And another big supporter of African liberation that does not get enough credit is, of course, Cuba. It was because of Cuba's sacrifice that Angola was able to maintain its independence. In fact, Cuba under Castro intervened on a massive scale without getting permission from the Soviet Union. Even though the Soviet Union was subsidizing Cuba's economy, Cuba's military, all the weapons came from the Soviet Union. So you would think that they might want to check in first with their main benefactor, and say, well, this is what we plan to do. But no, they did not want to risk the possibility of the Soviet Union saying no, because the Soviet Union by that time was trying to mend relations with the West and the United States. So they thought another intervention in Africa would jeopardize that. And that's precisely what actually happened. But had Cuba not done that, Angola, which had just won its independence under the party called the MPLA, which was led by Agostinho Neto, who was, of course, very pro-Soviet Union and pro-China as well, would have lost. There were two other contenders. One was UNITA, which was led by Jonas Savimbi, who was supported by the CIA and the West, and the other was Holden Robato, and his party was the FNLA, which was also supported by the CIA and the West. So one of those two would have ended up being the leader of Angola, and Angola would have been another reactionary country in Africa. But Cuba did not take that chance. So Cuba sent thousands of soldiers, first help them to win that independence. So the government formed after Portuguese colonial rule collapsed in 1975 was by the MPLA, seen as more like socialist, Marxist leaning. But then by 1987, the other parties, UNITA in particular, had crept back on the scene in a big way. The United States was supporting Savimbi, gave him very sophisticated weapons that even the Pentagon did not want him to have, like shoulder-held Stinger missiles that could shoot down the planes of the Angolan government or the Cuban military that was helping. So he became very powerful. And South Africa also sent its army, and South Africa was still ruled by the white racist apartheid regime. So now Angola once again had its back against the wall. And we learned two lessons here. Cuba, when it comes to fighting in Africa, they knew much more than the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union, after that early experience in 1975 when Cuba went on a massive scale without their permission, now they're there all over the place. So Cuba can't do things like, without the Soviet Union knowing about it. So the Soviet Union told the Angolan government, we will advise you on how to fight the South Africans and, the Western puppet, UNITA, under Savimbi. And they suffered major defeats on the battlefield. In one battle, losing up to, I've read, 2,000 soldiers, the Angolans. And Castro said, you're going to lose this war. And once again, without permission from the Soviet Union, sent about 30,000 Cuban soldiers and the best weapons he had. And there's a very interesting documentary about it. It's called Cuba, African Odyssey. And the filmmaker, her name is El Tahari, Tahri. She's an Egyptian-French filmmaker. And it describes how Castro himself was in command of the battle by satellite phone. So he wasn't even in Angola, he's back in Havana, but directing the battle. The famous Battle of Cuito, Cuanavale, where they defeated the South African army. And it was spectacular in many ways, because first of all, this was similar to Adwa, where you have Europeans, the South African army, essentially Europeans, right? Being brought up from childhood that they are superior to non-whites, and there's no way could they lose in Angola. So when they were defeated and they had to withdraw, they realized something very critical. Then you know what? Since this Castro guy cannot even be controlled by the Soviet Union, they might actually follow us into South Africa and defeat us militarily in South Africa and end apartheid on their own terms. And that might not have been the worst things. But they started acting, as Walter Rodney said, the system tries to stay one step ahead. So what did they do? They had been occupying Namibia, they called it Southwest Africa, for decades. They suddenly withdrew and Namibia became independent. They went back to South Africa. 2 years later, they released Nelson Mandela. They started negotiating for the post-apartheid state in South Africa. In 1994, of course, they had elections. Mandela became the first president. But once again, as Rodney said, the system is always one step ahead. South Africa, apartheid ended officially in 1994. Today, in 2023, the 8% European, less than 10%, 8% European population of South Africa controls 72% of the arable land. Just think about that. That was the essence of the fight against apartheid. And we're talking decades later. There's not been any significant land reform. But I could say that that is a battle for the current generation. Many people are critical of Nelson Mandela, that he negotiated and he gave too much to the white power structure. But I disagree with that analysis. My analysis would be that Mandela fought to the extent where he could take it. At least he brought formal apartheid to an end, just like Kwame Nkrumah brought formal colonization to an end in Ghana and then other African countries. The struggle for the next form of decolonization, that belongs to this generation. And hopefully, it won't wait till the next generation. That's my own analysis about it. And of course, you see it happening now in South Africa. You see the economic freedom fighters, the party of Julius Malema. Each election cycle, they're getting more and more people elected to the parliament of South Africa. And they've been very clear. They say, we're going to take the land without compensation. Why should you compensate somebody whose ancestors killed Africans and then stole their land? Why should we pay them money? And now the current government of the African National Congress is also adopting some of this language because they can see the election results too in each successive election cycle. They know if they don't address the land issue, eventually they will be swept out of office as well.